Follow up on the MRI, because President Trump yesterday said that he would release the results of his MRI. Is that happening right now?
It is happening right now. As part of, and this is a summary from the president's physician, and we will release it right now. I think my team has it teed up for all of you. I'll read it for you, and then you'll get it physically as well. As part of President Trump's comprehensive executive physical, advanced imaging was performed because men in his age group benefit from a thorough evaluation of cardiovascular and abdominal health. The purpose of this imaging is preventative, to identify any issues early, confirm overall health, and ensure the president maintains long-term vitality and function. President Trump's cardiovascular imaging was perfectly normal. No evidence of arterial narrowing impairing blood flow or abnormalities in the heart or major vessels. The heart chambers are normal in size, the vessel walls appear smooth and healthy, and there are no signs of inflammation or clotting.
Okay, so you have got to see what just happened in the White House briefing room, because this is the kind of moment that really captures the absolute chaos and dysfunction that's happening inside Trump's administration right now. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, who is supposed to be one of the most composed and professional communications people in the Trump orbit, just completely and totally lost it during a press briefing. And I'm not talking about getting a little frustrated or showing some emotion. I'm talking about a full-blown meltdown where she was yelling at reporters, getting visibly shaken, and ultimately just storming out of the briefing room entirely while journalists were still asking questions and demanding answers about what's actually going on inside the White House. This is not normal behavior from a press secretary. This is the behavior of someone who is completely overwhelmed and unable to handle the pressure of the job anymore. And frankly, this entire incident shows us exactly what's happening to Trump's ability to communicate and defend his administration to the American people and to the media. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
His abdominal imaging is also perfectly normal. All major organs appear very healthy and well perfused. Everything evaluated is functioning within normal limits with no acute or chronic concerns. In summary, this level of detailed assessment is standard for an executive physical at President Trump's age and confirms that he remains in excellent overall health. Again, we will provide that to you. I think that's quite a bit of detail, and in the effort of transparency, the president promised it last night, and we have delivered today. So there you go.
The whole thing started when reporters began pressing Leavitt hard on some critical internal reports that the White House has been withholding from the public. We're talking about reports that detail DOJ file gaps, the signal leaks that have been exposing classified information, ethics violations tied to Trump probes, and all kinds of other scandals that show serious problems with how the administration is being run. The journalists in that room wanted answers. They wanted to know what was in those reports. They wanted to know why the White House was refusing to release them publicly. They wanted transparency and accountability from an administration that has been promising to be tough on corruption and protecting national security. So they pressed Leavitt on these questions, which is literally their job as members of the media. They asked the press secretary why the administration was stonewalling on these critical reports and what exactly was the White House hiding. These are legitimate questions that any reporter worth their salt would be asking when an administration is refusing to release documents that should be available to the public. Leavitt tried to defend Trump by going on the attack against his political enemies. She started attacking people like New York Attorney General Letitia James and calling them corrupt, and using language that was clearly meant to deflect from the actual questions that reporters were asking about the reports and the scandals. She was trying to change the subject by attacking Trump's critics instead of actually answering the questions about why the reports weren't being released and what transparency failures the administration was actually covering up. But that's the thing. When you're a press secretary and reporters are asking you legitimate questions about your administration's actions and your administration's record, you can't just attack the other side and hope that people forget about the substantive questions that are being asked. You have to answer the questions. You have to provide information. You have to show that your administration is serious about being transparent and accountable to the American people. When reporters pressed her further on specific issues like the autism policy announcements and the broader accountability questions about what was happening inside the White House, Leavitt just snapped. She started yelling. She was clearly frustrated and angry and defensive. She shouted something like, "That's what the White House wants," in response to questions about administration policy, which doesn't even make sense as a coherent answer to legitimate journalistic inquiry. And then she just bolted. She stood up and walked out of the briefing room while reporters were still asking questions and while the entire incident was being broadcast to the American public. The press secretary of the United States, who is supposed to be a professional communicator and a representative of the president, just abandoned the briefing room and left the cameras rolling while she stormed out. This is the kind of moment that gets replayed on every news network and shared all over social media and talked about by political analysts and commentators because it's such a visible symbol of the chaos and dysfunction happening inside Trump's White House. What makes this moment so significant is that it shows the world that the press secretary has completely lost her composure and her ability to handle the pressure of the job. A press secretary is supposed to be a calming influence in the briefing room. They're supposed to be someone who can handle tough questions from aggressive reporters without losing their cool or storming out or attacking people instead of answering substantive questions. When the press secretary loses control like this, it sends a signal to the entire country that things inside the White House are completely chaotic and out of control. It tells people that the Trump administration is not prepared to handle scrutiny and accountability, and that they're willing to just shut down the briefing and walk away when the questions get too difficult. And it undermines the entire purpose of having press briefings in the first place, which is to provide information to the American people about what their government is doing and why their government is making the decisions that it's making. Let's really dig into what happened during this briefing and what led to Leavitt absolutely losing her mind in front of the cameras, because there's a lot of context here that helps explain why the press secretary was so clearly frustrated and defensive during this entire exchange. Back on June 26, 2025, Leavitt was called into a briefing to face reporters. And from the moment she walked into that room, you could feel the tension. The reporters in that room had done their homework. They knew about the missing reports. They knew about the DOJ file gaps that have been plaguing the administration. They knew about the signal leaks that have been exposing classified military operations and personal information about people inside the White House. They knew about the ethics violations that have been connected to various Trump probes and investigations. And they came to the briefing with one goal in mind: to get the press secretary to explain why these reports were being withheld from the public and what the White House was covering up by refusing to release them. Leavitt went into that briefing knowing that she was going to face tough questions, but I don't think she was prepared for how relentless and how coordinated the media pressure was going to be. Multiple reporters from different news organizations were asking variations of the same question: where are the reports? And why is the White House refusing to be transparent about its internal investigations and scandals? This is the kind of sustained media pressure that can really throw off even experienced communications professionals, because you're getting hit with the same basic question from multiple angles and multiple reporters, and you have to come up with answers that are somehow different or more satisfying than the ones you've already given. But in this case, Leavitt didn't really have good answers to give. The White House was refusing to release the reports, and Leavitt was supposed to defend that decision without being able to explain why the reports were being withheld or what exactly was in them that was so sensitive that it couldn't be released to the public. So Leavitt tried a different approach. Instead of answering the questions about the reports and the transparency failures, she went on the offense and started attacking Trump's political enemies. She brought up Letitia James, who is the New York Attorney General and who has been involved in various legal proceedings against Trump. She called James and other critics corrupt. She used inflammatory language that was clearly designed to change the subject from the actual questions about the reports to the broader culture war narrative that Trump supporters have been pushing. This is a classic political communications technique. When you don't have a good answer to a legitimate question, you attack the other side and try to make it about them instead of about your own administration's failures and problems. But the reporters in that room were not going to let her off the hook. They kept pressing her on the actual questions about the reports and what was inside them and why the White House was stonewalling on transparency. The questions started getting more specific and more detailed as the briefing went on. Reporters asked about the autism policy announcements that the White House had been making and whether there were accountability measures being taken inside the administration related to these policies. They asked about the broader patterns of administration misconduct that seemed to be revealed by the internal documents that the White House was refusing to release. They asked direct questions about whether the administration was trying to hide evidence of wrongdoing by refusing to release these critical reports. And as the questions got more specific and more difficult, Leavitt's demeanor started to visibly change. You could see the frustration building. You could see her getting more defensive. You could see her becoming increasingly agitated as she realized that the reporters were not going to accept deflections and attacks on Trump's critics as answers to substantive questions about White House dysfunction and scandal. And then it happened. Leavitt snapped. She started yelling. She yelled something about "that's what the White House wants" in response to accountability questions, which doesn't even parse as a coherent response to the questions that were being asked. It's the kind of thing you yell when you're frustrated and angry and you're not thinking about your words anymore. You're just reacting emotionally to the pressure and the scrutiny. And the moment she yelled that, she realized she had lost control of the situation. She realized that she could no longer maintain the composure that a press secretary is supposed to maintain when facing a hostile media environment. So she did what people do when they completely lose it. She stood up and she left. She walked out of the briefing room while cameras were rolling and reporters were still asking questions, and the entire nation was watching this unfold in real time. The incident sparked rumors that Leavitt was about to resign from her position as press secretary, because this kind of meltdown is often the sign that someone is about to step down and leave their job. When you lose control like this in front of the cameras, it's usually a sign that you've reached your breaking point and you can't handle the pressure anymore. But surprisingly, Leavitt has remained in her role despite the meltdown and despite the obvious signs that she was struggling to do the job. This suggests that either Trump is willing to tolerate this kind of erratic behavior from his press secretary, or Leavitt has decided that she's going to tough it out and continue trying to defend the administration from the intense media scrutiny that she's facing on a daily basis. Either way, it's a signal that things inside the White House are completely chaotic, and that even the people who are supposed to be communicating Trump's message are losing their ability to maintain professional composure. What's particularly interesting about the Leavitt meltdown is that it ties directly to her broader style and approach to the job. According to reports and observations from people who have watched her work, Leavitt has been prioritizing conversations with podcasters and alternative media figures over traditional mainstream media outlets. She's been more comfortable sitting down for long-form interviews with friendly hosts who are going to lob soft questions at her than she is doing formal press briefings with reporters from major news organizations who are trained to ask tough questions and push back on evasive answers. This suggests that Leavitt and the Trump administration more broadly have been trying to bypass traditional media and reach audiences through alternative channels where they have more control over the message and less scrutiny of their policies and their record. But when you're the White House press secretary, you can't avoid traditional media. You have to face reporters. You have to answer tough questions. And if you're not prepared to do that because you've been spending all your time talking to friendly podcasters, then you're going to struggle and eventually you're going to lose your composure like Leavitt did. Here's the real significance of Leavitt's meltdown and what it tells us about the state of Trump's presidency and his ability to govern effectively. When your press secretary is losing control and storming out of briefings and yelling at reporters, that's a sign that your administration is in serious trouble. The press secretary is supposed to be one of the most composed and professional people in any White House because that person is the public face of the administration's communications strategy. When that person falls apart, it sends a message to the entire country that things inside the White House are completely chaotic and out of control. It tells people that the Trump administration cannot handle scrutiny and accountability. It tells people that the administration is not prepared to answer tough questions about its policies and its record. The breakdown also shows us how Trump's defenses are eroding in real time as the media pressure intensifies. Leavitt's meltdown is a direct result of the relentless questioning from reporters about the reports that the White House is refusing to release and the scandals that those reports apparently document. The media is doing its job, asking tough questions about government transparency and accountability. But the Trump administration is not prepared to handle that level of scrutiny anymore because the administration has so many problems and so many scandals that it can't possibly defend itself against all of the questions that are being asked. When you have that many issues to deal with, when you have that much bad news piling up, when you have that many reports documenting problems inside your administration, eventually your communications people are going to break under the pressure. That's what happened to Leavitt. This incident is also going to fuel further defections from the Trump administration and further fractures in the Republican Party coalition. When members of Congress see the press secretary losing control like this, they start wondering whether it's time to distance themselves from Trump and from the administration because it's becoming increasingly clear that this presidency is imploding. Ally defections are going to accelerate because fewer and fewer people are going to want to be associated with an administration that's falling apart this visibly. GOP fractures are going to get wider because Republicans are going to start splitting on whether they should continue to support Trump's agenda or whether they should start protecting their own political interest by distancing themselves from a failing presidency. The Leavitt meltdown is also going to contribute to the momentum behind impeachment calls because it's another visible symbol of the chaos and dysfunction inside the Trump White House. When your press secretary is melting down in front of the cameras, that's the kind of thing that makes members of Congress wonder whether the president is actually competent enough to hold office. It's the kind of thing that makes people question whether this administration should continue to hold power or whether it's time for serious accountability measures to be taken. The judicial rebukes that have been coming down against various Trump administration policies are going to be even more damaging now because reporters can point to Leavitt's meltdown as evidence that the administration is so chaotic that it can't even properly defend itself against questions about why it's refusing to release internal reports. What we're seeing with the Leavitt incident is the complete erosion of Trump's credibility as his administration faces increasingly intense media scrutiny and as more and more scandals pile up and more people inside the administration break under the pressure. The press secretary is supposed to be the guardian of the administration's message and the person who communicates Trump's policies and decisions to the American people. When that person is losing control and yelling at reporters and storming out of briefings, it means the administration has lost control of its message and its ability to defend itself against scrutiny and criticism. It means the administration is entering a death spiral where chaos leads to more scandals, which leads to more media pressure, which leads to more chaos and more breakdowns like what we saw with Leavitt. The timing of this meltdown is particularly significant because it's happening against the backdrop of all the other scandals and failures that we've been talking about. The signal leaks are exposing classified information. The DOJ lawyers are quitting en masse. The GOP is fracturing and splitting up. Republican members are distancing themselves from Trump. And now the press secretary is losing control in the briefing room. It's all of these things happening simultaneously that creates a sense of complete administrative breakdown and chaos. When you put all of these elements together, you get a picture of an administration that is completely falling apart and that is not prepared to handle the level of scrutiny and pressure that it's facing. The Leavitt meltdown is just the most visible and dramatic symbol of that broader collapse, but it's part of a much larger pattern of failures and dysfunction that are going to define Trump's second term if he doesn't make some dramatic changes very quickly.